Welcome back. In this part of the session, I would like to invite you to engage with the story of David and Bathsheba as presented in the text I ask you to read in the second book of Samuel, Hebrew Bible, two chapters, 11 and 12. This is clearly a morally charged story that tells us how David falls for a beautiful woman, Bathsheba, who is bathing and whom he spots from a distance from the roof of his house. David discovers that the woman is the wife of a soldier, Uriah the Hittite, who serves in David's army. He sends messengers to her who summon her to David. David sleeps with her. She conceives a child by him. When he finds out that Bathsheba is pregnant, David commands Uriah to return from the battle in order to allow him to sleep with his wife, so that David's adultery may be covered up. Uriah, who is also a loyal soldier, refuses to return to the comforts of his home and chooses to sleep with the servants at the king's door. In order to resolve the moral mess which he himself created, David sends Uriah to the most dangerous part of the battle to be allowed to die there. Uriah carries a letter written by David to the king's army general Joab. The letter in effect condemns Uriah to death. Uriah dies on the battlefield. David then marries Bathsheba, but their child subsequently dies. The story doesn't end there, but since several significant moral issues have come up, I think it's probably good if we consider them now and see that as the events pile up, we probably feel, when we read this story, a sense of moral outrage. David, as set out in this narrative, seems to be blind to the existence of moral boundaries. His moral self-understanding, as well as understanding of the other or others, are quite primitive, even though he's a king. His manipulative techniques through which he uses others and abuses his power are highly disordered, we may want to say. He doesn't respect the marital state of Bathsheba, nor of her husband, who is his faithful soldier. He betrays him. He cares more about his moral appearance than about his inner moral state. This is the ethical evaluation. I hope it doesn't sound like a moral judgmentalism. It's more a moral judgment which we, in the ethical discourse, are encouraged to do in order to fully grasp the moral sense of the story. But to go back to the story of David, so we realize his kind of not very strong moral state, the way he stages the events in order to keep the moral appearance, and eventually how the story ends, because the story doesn't end there. The story ends, at least in the two chapters we've been considering, that David eventually comes to realize that his inner state is messy and perhaps immoral, and comes to terms with his failures. But I'm mostly interested, how exactly does the moral breakthrough take place? And there is an important encounter in the chapters we read, in the chapter 12, that is relevant to our topic here in the session of imagination and the power of imagination. And this is the imaginative engagement through the parable related to David by the prophet Nathan. The parable is about two men, one rich, who owns many flocks and herds, and the other poor, who had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he bought. I've read the whole two sentences maybe because they are, I think that they capture so well why they are so powerful. So the poor man who, quote, had nothing but one little ewe lamb which he had bought, he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meagre fare, and drink from his cup, and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. End of quote. But when the traveler arrived, the rich man uses that poor man's lamb, doesn't use his own herd of sheep and animals that he had, but takes the poor man's lamb and serves it to the traveler. When we learn from this narrative that David gets angry, and he says to Nathan, I quote again, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." Nathan said to David, quote, "You are the man." The scene with the prophet Nathan is an example of how verbal images, in literature there is a phrase, Greek word, ekphrasis, verbal images in the text, how they can influence the listener in their opening up to goodness. David, of course, can choose to ignore the message or simply look at the parable as a moving narrative without making any connection to himself. But thanks to Nathan, he does make the connection. Here, he's maybe not, I think it's still a moral imagination, but also another type of imagination, analogical imagination, is at work. He relates the action of the rich man to his own behavior. He sees that pity is what was lacking in the rich man, and pity is what is lacking in himself. The parallel is clear to us who are dispassionate observers now reading this parable, but it might not have been immediately clear to David. Nathan spells out the link, and he does it so poignantly and directly. "You are the man," he says. The power of the overall story for us is one thing, and the power of the story within the story is another. So it's worth noting there are two stories here, one inside the other. We've got the story of David and Bathsheba, and then within that story, the story of David's encounter with the prophet. The pedagogical value of fostering moral understanding through stories cannot be better expressed than it is here, and it is probably that is why I love using this story in so many different ways. But what does happen when David connects his moral state with the message conveyed to him by Nathan? He's no longer a dispassionate observer. He becomes an extension of the character from the parable. We don't know what happens to the rich man in the parable, but we know what happens to David. David repents, comforts Bathsheba, and we can say that in some way, even if there are later stories that don't fully agree with what I'm going to say, but at this point we could say that David succeeds in a moral sense. There is a sense of transformation, and this sense of transformation, or the transformation itself, is triggered by not just playful engagement with the story David hears, but with a genuine translation of the message of the story to himself. It is clear that from the beginning of the story, David's imagination is at work. His first encounter with Bathsheba from a distance, while watching her bathing, an episode which aroused his interest in her, suggests to us a set of images that must have filled David's mind. The reader does not share the vision of Bathsheba bathing, but she is not described beyond the short statement that the woman was very beautiful. All we know that the embodiment of David's, I wouldn't say imagination, but David's fantasies resulted in a very complex, morally complex situation, which led to a moral disaster. David lacked empathy, the ability to put himself in the shoes of the other and to respond to his or her situation appropriately. He was not able, or perhaps unwilling, to put himself in his imagination in the position of either Uriah or Bathsheba. Thanks to Nathan, however, David's moral imagination becomes mobilized. There are many aspects of this story which we could explore further, and perhaps this is something you would want to consider for the forum discussion. But on the basis of our analysis, so far, it is clear that moral conversion, or perhaps any conversion, cannot happen without imagination. Here I want to suggest that a genuine, true transformation is taking place by mobilization or mobilizing the moral imagination. Zoe Bennett, who is known to the Federation and wrote many wonderful pieces and books, wrote a paper entitled, and a reference is in the bibliography, entitled Creation Made Image and Image Made Word. And in this paper she makes a very useful distinction between eyesight and heart sight, or sight and insight. To understand the human condition, Zoe Bennett implies that one has to have both. Providing the eyesight is clear, there is a correlation between what is seen and what is the truth. David initially sees, this is my interpretation, David initially sees with his eyes only. Later on he begins to notice with his heart. The heart sight or the insight takes place when he makes the connection between the rich man's story and his own life story. It seems that until these two ways of seeing, eyesight and heart sight, merge and become what I call a moral seeing, the openness to goodness or transformation cannot take place. The leap from mind to heart, from mental recognition to heart acceptance, which at each stage involves imagination, is only possible when these two realities, eyesight and heart sight, connect. Through his encounter with Nathan, David begins to practice his moral imagination and lives out what he sees. There are many emotions evoked in this story from the beginning to end, and all these emotions are cognitively important. The visual representations in words describing the character of the poor man in the parable are exceptionally rich and emotionally charged. In this short verbal description that we just heard, especially about the poor man who owned this little ewe lamb, we have almost the whole story of that person. We don't need more sentences. We have a very clear insight into the goodness of the poor man and the lack of goodness in the rich man, together with Nathan's sharp words, which enable David to find the truth about himself. Theologically, one can describe this moment as an encounter with grace, which initiates something really profound, a profound change, a true heart sight. From this moment on, David sees himself differently. His moral outlook changes, and his openness to goodness takes place. I think I'll stop here, and I'd like you to engage, as you did with the poem. Take 5-10 minutes, whatever you can spare, and read that story again, read these 2 chapters again, and try to perhaps add some of the insights or see them differently to the way I propose to engage with this story. Maybe you will find some other points that I've missed, or some points that are especially important to you, and try to reflect and think maybe again about these 4 elements that we noted in Mark Johnson's definition of the moral imagination, and how you can perhaps apply to this story, or these 2 stories. There are several sub-stories. On the module page, you will have a link to 2 paintings, one by Rembrandt and one by his student Willem Drost. These are 2 images or visualization of Bathsheba, who is actually a silent character in the story. You probably have come across books that take the story, or films that take this story of David and Bathsheba and develop narratives or extensions of the biblical narratives. There are so many, several films that I've come across, but also so many publications that draw insights or try to extend the biblical narrative. But I would like you to have a look at these 2 paintings. They are in Louvre. The photographs I'm including on that page are the 2 photos I took myself. They're maybe not very clear, but you can probably see a very different representation of Bathsheba. So when you are reflecting on this narrative, biblical narrative, reading these 2 chapters, I would like to encourage you to finish your reading, your reflection, by engaging with the 2 paintings, and whether you see them as exactly the same, think about the face, if you can see well the pictures, what kind of face expression is given to Bathsheba by each of the painters, what's the difference. I don't want to interpret these paintings for you. I'm really interested how you see them, and maybe you want to share with the group your own interpretation. I tried in different contexts to give my own position, but I felt that that sort of stops people being more creative. So I want to leave at this point this reflection, and then we'll want to hear from you how you see, especially the paintings, but any other insights that you want to add to the reflections I've shared with you here. Thank you very much.